Hi, I'm Gavin Haverstick with Haverstick Designs,
I'm Ryan Brinkworth.
and this is The Sound Project.
So today we're back with another episode, and today we're going to go over treatment types and when to apply them.
Yeah, it's a big topic. There's a lot of things going on with acoustical treatment. There's a lot of different types of products, but we're going to kind of break it down into product types. We're not going to focus too much on individual products from a manufacturer, let's say. We'll show some examples, but we're going to talk about product types as a whole.
Cool.
Yeah.
So the main types seem to be like absorption and diffusion. So let's go ahead and start with absorption. So go ahead and just tell us what it is.
Yeah, on a basic level, absorption really is something that's going to remove energy from the room, and it's something where if we break it down into like kind of passive absorbers, which would be foam and fiberglass and soft porous materials, with those passive absorbers, it actually absorbs sound in tiny amounts of heat. It's a friction loss that happens. Like these sound waves are trying to fight through these porous materials, and there's resistance there, and it gets absorbed. So the panel doesn't heat up necessarily, and not going to be hot to the touch or anything like that, but that is how absorption works. And it's going to remove energy from the room. So as sound is bouncing around the room, it hits these softer surfaces and then gets reduced in energy.
Cool.
Yeah.
And so with that, how do we measure that then?
Yeah, so it actually dates back. There's some cool history with absorption. Wallace Sabine was a professor at Harvard, and he's a young professor at Harvard, and was tasked with trying to improve this lecture hall named Fogg Lecture Hall. He was really curious about why this lecture hall sounded so poor in comparison to the Sanders Theater, which was really close to it. And they're around the same size as far as these spaces are concerned, but one of them sounded great. The Sanders Theater was known to be acoustically really nice, but then the lecture hall was awful. And so he was tasked with trying to fix that. And Wallace Sabine, he's kind of considered the grandfather of architectural acoustics. Like he did all the initial research and really started studying it as a science back when he was a professor there. And him and some of his students actually would take, it was at night, way after everyone had left, for the day, they would start taking some of the cushions, the seat cushions that were in the Sanders Theater, and bringing them into the lecture hall to try to see what kind of difference that would make. And they even brought in an organ and a stopwatch, and was trying to come up with how many padded seats we added in here. How is that going to affect what later would become the reverb time? He was studying all of that, and he actually came up with the first reverb time equation, which is the Sabine equation, that's named after him. But he was just really a curious guy when it came to all these acoustical properties, and it was just through experimentation and just pure curiosity that made him want to study it more. That then led to Riverbank Acoustical Labs up near Chicago, where it's a laboratory, does some really fascinating things. There's actually a whole book called The Sabines at Riverbank that tells the whole history of this place and the acoustical studies that were done there. But it was just an amazing thing. I've been up there a few times and taken tours. They have a museum there just showing some of the history. They even did like code breaking in the war there at that facility. They just did a lot of different scientific things. But they built this reverb chamber, and it's something where Wallace's cousin Paul ended up taking up after Wallace had passed away. He went to Riverbank and carried on his studies on acoustics. And they have this reverb chamber where they wanted to test different types of absorption materials and what would happen if you tried different things. And so it's a big concrete room. It's kind of wild. You actually go down on a little conveyor belt to get down there, because they built it so that they could bring materials down there to test it. But it's underground. It's concrete inside the room and airspace, and then another thick layer of concrete. It's basically just a big bunker for them to do these measurements. And so Paul started doing these tests. They called it the man in the box test. And I actually have an image here I can share with you for those just listening that aren't seeing it on YouTube. What I'm looking at here is basically a man in a box. He is in this big concrete room. There's an organ in that space. And the reason that he's sitting in a box and only his head is popping out of it was because he didn't want the absorption that would naturally happen from his body to affect his measurements like he did, because people absorb sound too.
Sure.
And so he's sitting in here with his head popping out, and he needed to have his head pop out because he needed to be able to hear the decay of sound in that concrete room. And so, it's I always say the best measurement gear we have is attached to our head. So his ears needed to be free and clear and be able to hear. But inside that box is actually a controller to be able to play that organ. And so what he would do is play different notes, and he would know the frequency of that note. And he would have a stopwatch in there where he would just turn it on when he started the note, and then he'd let it go and hit the stopwatch, and until it died out, he would pause it again. And that is actually, it seems really rudimentary and not as scientific as we could be now.
Sure.
However, this equation is still used today in calculating. We use it every week here in the office. And he developed an equation to be able to figure out reverb time based on this method.
Sure.
And so this laboratory is still, this room that he did all this initial tests in, this is where a lot of the acoustical treatment manufacturers test their materials, where you actually measure the room when it's completely empty and get the reverb time at various frequencies. And then you place 72 square feet of an absorption material inside the room, and you measure it again. And the difference between the reverb times, there's a calculation to be able to figure out what we call absorption coefficients. And absorption coefficients is a metric that we use to see how good materials are at absorbing different frequencies. And it varies per frequency. So it's something where you may have an absorption coefficient at 125 hertz. It's going to be different than what it does at 250 hertz and 500, 1,000. But we get a lot of data from doing measurements in labs like this. There is actually a metric called NRC, which is the noise reduction coefficient. And I would say that it's next to worthless as far as like a metric is concerned. I understand that it's something the industry wanted to have a single number rating that would tell how good a material is at absorbing sound.
Sure.
But you can't really boil it down to that simple of a thing, like a one number rating to tell the entire story.
Sure.
Because the way the NRC is calculated is actually you take the absorption coefficients at 250 hertz, 500 hertz, 1,000 hertz, and 2,000 hertz. So those four frequency bands, and you just average them together.
There's a lot of bands missing there.
Yeah, a lot of things. I mean, you're not telling anything about how good it does below 250 hertz or above 2,000 hertz, and so there's just a lot of missing information there.
Sure.
So I'm always really cautious when I'm looking at NRC values, and I'll pop this up on the screen here now. Is that this is absorption coefficients here? So 125 hertz, 250 hertz, and 500, 1,000, and 2,000, and 4,000. And the numbers here are the absorption coefficients. So at 125 hertz, a half-inch drywall on studs has a 0.29 absorption coefficient. Now, I'll get on my soapbox a little bit about this because absorption coefficients are not percentages of sound absorbed. A lot of times people will say that. It's even in some college textbooks that way. But the way that the math is written and the way that it's derived, it's not a percentage of sound absorbed. It's just compared to a flat reflective surface. So you could actually get absorption coefficients above 1, which doesn't mean, let's say, I've seen some materials have a 1.2 absorption coefficient at certain frequencies.
Sure.
That doesn't mean it absorbs 100% of the sound, creates 20% more, and then absorbs that again. You can't absorb more than 100% in that way. So It's just relative. And so you always look at these as relative numbers. So if something, this example, for instance, a half-inch drywall on studs at 125 hertz is a 0.29. Painted concrete block is a 0.10. So half-inch drywall is approximately 3 times as good at absorbing 125 hertz as concrete is.
Sure.
And the thing about concrete is it just doesn't budge with low frequencies. Like, it's a solid material, and it's something that's not going to flex like drywall does. Because as sound waves hit drywall, it flexes a little bit, absorbs a little bit of that energy, kind of like the shocks of your car would. But if you look at absorption coefficients at 125 hertz, half-inch drywall is 3 times as good as painted concrete block. But if we go over here to the end column, which is the NRC, they have identical NRCs. 0.05 for half-inch drywall and 0.05 for painted concrete block. And that's why it's just a misleading metric. It's something where if you went by NRC alone, you might think that a half-inch drywall, a room that's completely covered in half-inch drywall on studs would sound the exact same as one that's concrete. And that's just not the case.
Sure.
And it's because of this, because 125 hertz, that's not even included in the metric, and neither is 4,000. All you do is take these four metrics, or these four absorption coefficients here at 250, 500, 1,000, and 2,000, and average them together. And that's why NRC is I rarely look at NRC, because if there is an NRC number, that means a test was done, because you have to have absorption coefficients to get to NRC.
Sure.
So I'd rather look at a test report and see how it does at all the frequencies rather than just the average there.
Sure. And especially for what we do, it really is important to have it at that level by frequency opposed to just looking at an NRC.
For sure, because every room is different, and you're going to run into different issues at certain frequency bands that you might want to look at a certain material that absorbs really well in this one band but doesn't absorb well in the higher frequencies, because you're trying to get the room back in balance. And so, yeah, the absorption coefficients are key. If we're ever recommending a product, I can't say that we've ever really recommended a product that doesn't have absorption coefficients, that we can at least reference.
Cool. All right. So then the next thing will be to talk about diffusion. So do you want to explain what diffusion is?
Sure. Yeah. Diffusion is a scattering of energy. Okay. Instead of removing it like absorption does, it actually scatters it within the room but retains that liveliness. I often tell people it's like having a nozzle at the end of a water hose. You're going to spray out the same amount of water. It's just spread out over a wider pattern. And so as sound waves hit a diffuser, it scatters it into smaller bits but pushes that back into the room. And the way that is done is by using hard reflective surfaces and having typically either a mathematical or a geometrical shape that pushes that energy back into the room. So it's cool. It's definitely more of a fine tuning of how you're going to treat your room. Sure. And whereas absorption is just kind of easy to be able to put that up. It's going to take energy out, but where you place diffusion and how you implement it is kind of a science and an art
Sure.
form. With diffusion, just like absorption, there's going to be metrics associated with that. There's scattering coefficients, and scattering coefficients, the definition of that is it's the ratio of the non-specularly reflected sound energy to the total reflected energy. So we all know what that means, right? It's,
exactly.
If we look on this plot here, actually, diffusers, they actually have polar plots that you can do testing on and to see how evenly the sound is scattered off of the surface. Okay. And the best diffusers are going to be a lot more consistent as far as how the energy comes off of that surface versus some diffusers, if they're not built properly or the math isn't there, or if it's just a hard reflective surface, you'll have hot spots that happen from reflections that are coming in. So this polar plot that I'm showing here is, sound comes in at an angle at 45 degrees right here. And what it's measuring is how much sound is kind of billowing off of that surface in different areas. So you see these kind of areas here where it's showing spikes in certain spots and a reflective condition over here. Let's look at that first. The reflective condition shows 45-degree angle hitting a hard reflective surface, and then you see most of the energy is just going in this direction. Angle of incidence is equal to angle of reflection, and so it's going to hit that flat surface, and most of the energy is going to be skewed going the opposite direction at 45 degrees as well, because sound bounces around kind of like billiard balls on a pool table, and so that's what's going to happen if it's just a reflective surface. But in the diffusive condition, you have the initial sound coming in at 45 degrees, but notice it doesn't just spike over here at the other 45 degrees. Some sound is scattered in this direction, in this direction, in this direction, to where it's a more even coverage in the room. And so that's what's great about diffusion. It can break up a lot of issues when it comes to flutter echo and harsh reflections that are coming off of walls, ceilings. but it doesn't take the energy out of the room, so it retains that liveliness, and it can feel a little bit more musical and not as dead sounding as if you were just to line your room with all absorption.
Sure.
So there's those scattering coefficients that is derived, but then there's also a diffusion coefficient, which it's also a single number rating, but it's better than the NRC. But it is supposed to gauge the uniformity of that polar response. So this polar plot that we're looking at here, an ideal diffuser would actually have a response that looks just like this, where it's a semicircle, like everything that hits the sound hits that surface, and then it perfectly scatters energy in all directions with no lobing or null spots or things like that. That's obviously not something that happens in the real world. Everything is going to perform a little bit differently, and every diffuser has different characteristics. So
Sure.
this diffusion coefficient is helpful to be able to try to measure the quality of the diffuse sound, which is a tough thing to do because it's very subjective, but that's what the diffusion coefficient will do for you.
Okay. So then with the absorption, you talked about how like at Riverbank, they'll test different materials at different frequencies. So how do they find like basically the polar reaction with diffusers?
Yeah, it's a totally different type of test that is done. In the absorption coefficients, you're doing the reverb time chamber, and you're just trying to fill up that room with energy. And there's going to be random incidents that's happening all over the place, like sounds bouncing in from all different directions. With the polar plot, it's more of a measured, where you're measuring the angle that you're placing the speaker to be able to fire at these diffusion pieces, and there's more of a test rig to be able to figure out where sound is coming off of that surface. So it's much more refined, I think, and very, very specific when you're looking at to gather these polar plots.
Sure. And then with that, there's different types of diffusers as well. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that too?
Sure. Yeah. There's mathematical diffusers, which probably the most popular one would be a QRD, which is the quadratic residue diffuser, and that is something that you see all over the place. I actually have some examples here of some different diffusers, and we can kind of go through them. One thing, since we're speaking of diffusion, I always like to show this image, and if you're audio listeners, you can Google search Blackbird Studio C, and this space, I've actually been in this room and heard this room probably 3 years ago. I got to listen to Rocket Man by Elton John in Dolby Atmos in this space. Wow. Unbelievable. Like I remember the demo ended, and I told the gentleman that was helping us, I said, well, thanks for ruining music for me, because it's just like, it's such an interesting space to listen to sound. But what you're seeing here on the screen is there's these really deep kind of diffusion pieces. They're sticks of wood essentially, but some of them are 3 to 4 feet deep, and it's. I wanted to hear this room for the longest time because it is. The diffusion is so deep it almost acts like absorption, because there's some scattering that happens, but a lot of the sound that gets back in there between the pieces of wood, by the time it gets back to you, it's so reduced in energy that it's kind of like absorption. So it's a very strange thing. I would say that this wouldn't work as well in using traditional diffusers on the wall, because it just would be maybe a little too lively for what you're trying to do. But the room is just really interesting and just kind of a groundbreaking use of diffusion in a space like this. If we look at some other types of products, and I will call out like the brand and the type of diffuser so that you guys can look at it on your own and kind of find it online and do some more research on it. This first one is from one of our studios that we did for Crowder down in Atlanta, and we had this idea that on the back wall of his studio, his whole house looks like a museum. Like there's artwork everywhere, and I wanted to bring in some artwork into his studio, and the best place for that was kind of the back wall of his studio, like right where his speakers fire towards.
Sure.
And the problem with that is that typically you want that to be diffusive. And so we came up with this idea of building a bass trap on the back wall. So this bass trap is about 8 to 12 inches deep in this area here. But then built within that is a stretch fabric system where that artwork is actually printed on fabric and then tucked into the frame. And then we left a 3-inch gap there between the artwork and the front face of the bass trap so that we could put this clear diffuser. So this is from from RPG. It's called a diffuser.
Okay.
And so it allows you to see through it. It's made out of plexiglass. But with diffusion, the nice thing is that you can do that out of a lot of different materials. It could be plastic, it could be wood, it could be hardened fiberglass. As long as it's a reflective material and not an absorptive material, it works really well. But in this case, it's just a really unique way of doing that, because this diffuser right here that's in clear, it diffracts your vision a little bit as you're looking at that art piece, but you get to see all the vibrant colors through it. It also is used a lot of times in between a windowed surface and a sound critical room, where if you want to still have natural light come through, you can put a diffuser like this in front of it. So it's pretty neat.
Cool. Something I want to call out on Crowder's studio as well is anytime that someone like sees the video that we have on YouTube or something, he has something on the wall where it looks like a bunch of computer components, and I feel like people are always asking, like, is that serving any kind of acoustical purpose, like a diffuser or anything? So
yeah, that's a good question, and I get that question a lot too. He has this art piece. He has a bunch of kind of motherboards and computer chips and things like that. I'd probably say that the piece is at least 8 feet wide by 4 feet tall. It's a really big piece. It's awesome, and technically it's diffusing, sure, like it's scattering sound, but it's not meant to be a diffuser. It has varying depths as far as the different chips and things like that are concerned, and they're different sizes, and so that would scatter sound. But I specifically put that in a spot that wasn't receiving direct energy from the speakers, and in an area that wasn't critical. It wasn't where he tracks vocals or guitars or anything like that. It's kind of in a section of the room that's a little far off, but technically it is scattering sound. Same as a bookshelf would. Like a bookshelf. We've done that in a few spaces where like people that are composers or people that need their compositions at arm's reach, then we'll put a diffuser on the back wall, which is actually just a bookshelf. I always tell people they have to at least read books that are thick and thin for it to have some variance and be a good diffuser. But it's just a general scattering, and it's sure, it'd be great to have mathematical diffusers and ones that are just really doing an amazing job on that polar plot. But sometimes you just make use of what you have in your room.
Sure.
The next one here is Tyler Joseph's studio from 21 Pilots in his basement. And on the back wall, we used the Vicoustic multifuser. And this one is a kind of quadratic residue diffuser, but the front faces of them are angled rather than just being blocked off like a traditional like skyline diffuser from RPG would be.
Sure.
And sometimes our clients just really like the look of those, and I'll have to say aesthetics play a part in this. Diffusers have a very distinct look, and some people enjoy ones over the other. But you just want to make sure you're picking one that's going to perform well for you.
Sure.
We've also got, let's move to the next one here. This is also the multifuser from Vicoustic, but this one is in a Dolby Atmos room. This is Studio DMI in Las Vegas, Nevada, and this is Luca Predalesi's studio where we converted it from an existing mix room into a Dolby Atmos space. But the back wall and the ceiling have these multifusers on them that work really well. Let's see here. I'm going to move down to Dauphin Street Sound in Mobile, Alabama. This one was actually, and this is something that people can do. Like you can get the math for diffusers, get proper like QRD math online. Like there's a lot of websites that are available for that, and you can build your own. I will say that most clients who have built their own diffusers, they're glad they saved the money in doing so, but they never want to do it again. Like that's usually the reaction we get. We'll say, yeah, that was great because I didn't spend thousands of dollars on diffusers, but I won't ever get those hours of my life back. So it's a give and take. Building these, you have to be specific with these well depths and all of that, and to be able to get good diffusion. But it's something that the average person could build if they're fairly handy.
Cool.
And that's what Dauphin Street did here. Like on the back wall, you can see this diffuser here, and It's built into a bass trap like we typically do, but it's just made out of different like 4x4 posts that are the right depth. So it's very heavy. That's the other thing about building your own. Like when you go to a manufacturer, they've optimized it for weight and structural stability, whereas sometimes people will build it like this, where it's just like really, really heavy to install, and you got to make sure the wall is braced properly.
Sure.
But it's just an amazing diffuser, because in this room, instead of staining it, they actually just burned it with a blowtorch, and so it's pretty amazing in person. Like the photo doesn't even do it justice. Like in person, it really looks top notch. This next one's actually the one I was talking about with the bookshelf on the back wall. You don't see that in this photo, but he's a composer for video games, and it's Paul Brett Ensley, and in this studio, we have a lot of absorption materials, like the ceiling cloud. We have the soffit trap around the perimeter. We have vertical bass traps that are happening as well. But then there's these diffusers on the walls, which are from Part Science. And Part Science makes some different diffusion products, and this one happens to be one that we spec quite often, and it's a traditional diffuser. But then on the ceiling, there's these things called space couplers, which space couplers are like diffusion, but what they do is they allow the sound to bounce around the wells, but there's no wells within those openings. It's just completely open to the space above it. So you can use these in a lot of different ways, and I wouldn't say they're kind of a traditional diffuser, but they're fun to play with, to be able to increase the absorption of what's above it, but also be able to couple spaces together. You can have one space where you have certain acoustical properties, and you have a room next to it that has different acoustical properties. You can actually put these in line in that wall and be able to have that energy feed back into the room. There's all sorts of fun things you can do with that. Let's see. The next one here is Kent State University in Ohio, and we've got some barrel diffusers up here, high up on the wall. These would be an example of a geometric diffuser, and something where it's just a barrel shape that scatters sound pretty evenly. And it's something that polycylindrical diffusers are really popular back in older studios, where it's an easy thing to create. Like you have something blocking on the wall, and you put maybe plywood or some type of material that can flex a little bit, and you can curve it over and then create this barrel shape, and it adds some diffusion and some absorption of lower frequencies. And so these barrel diffusers are really popular, and this is a music studio, but it's also in band rooms and other sort of facilities where you get some bass trapping out of as well. The other product that's down here, and I'll have to say I'm a little biased about this product because I designed it and got a patent for it, but it's called the Flex 48, and the Flex 48 from Acoustical Fulfillment. And this is a kind of a hybrid absorber / diffuser product. You can change the way the room sounds on the fly by adding or removing this clear shield that you see here on the front face of it. And with the shield removed, it's just an absorber. It's going to absorb like a 2-inch thick fiberglass panel does. But then when the shield is put in place, it actually creates a barrel shape and gives you absorption coefficients in the 0.99 range and like 80 to 100 hertz. So you get some bass trapping, but then it's more diffusive in the higher frequencies.
Sure.
So that geometric shape is used quite often in a lot of different types of products out there. I have a couple more examples here for diffusers. This one here is Fox River Studios up near Green Bay, Wisconsin. And in here we have the RPG Omnifuser on the back wall. So this built into this back wall, there's again a bass trap there, but then there's also on the ceiling there's some RPG Omnifusers. And RPG just like pioneered a lot of this research when it came to diffusion, like Peter D'Antonio with RPG. There's countless white papers if you want to read them on diffusion, and he really furthered that science. I mean, did amazing things for the industry. This next one is the Aeolian diffuser from Acoustics First, and this is again, it's kind of a hybrid between a geometric diffuser and a QRD diffuser. So you're using QRD math to create this geometric shape, and it's just again a very interesting visual look. And some people make their decision on diffuser just based on the aesthetics alone. But it is a great diffuser. I've seen some testing results for it, and it really something that does well.
Cool. So then the next thing is kind of, you mentioned it on a couple of those studios, is bass trapping.
Yeah.
And bass trapping is kind of a weird one because it's technically an absorber, but it's also, it acts differently. So do you want to explain more about that?
Sure. So bass trapping is absorption, and it's something where it's targeting the lower frequencies because small rooms, they always struggle with the low frequency response, and it's something where we have to be very specific with the placement of these bass traps and the thickness of them if they're passive absorbers, or there's also tuned absorbers that we'll talk about that can really pinpoint certain frequency issues.
Sure.
When it comes to bass trapping, passive absorbers, it could just be, again, foam, fiberglass, cotton, all sorts of different types of insulation materials that can work really well for bass trapping. And there's just a plethora of acoustical data out there. There's actually a website which we can link in the description for Bob Gold's absorption coefficients, where he's gathered up all of these absorption coefficients for just hundreds of insulation types, and it's really a good, useful thing to be able to look at how well these different materials do, especially at the lower frequencies, because the thickness of a passive absorber is really going to dictate how well it performs in the lower frequency side of things. And for instance, let's just take a 2-inch fiberglass panel, for instance, like a Owens Corning 703. It's what you typically see for a fabric covered fiberglass panel. And a 2-inch panel has about a 0.42 absorption coefficient at 125 hertz, but a 4-inch is going to have around a 0.89, 0.9, somewhere in that range. So it's over double the effectiveness by increasing the thickness of it. Now, when you look at mid and higher frequency performance for that same panel, the 2-inch and 4-inch panel, they perform pretty similarly because you're not getting all that much more absorption in the highs because it's easy to absorb that energy. It's something where the wavelengths for low frequencies are really long and aggressive. For instance, 80 hertz, the wavelength for that is 14.125 feet. You're talking about a really long wavelength, and these are very powerful and aggressive waves, and it's hard to absorb it with thin materials. So it's not uncommon for us when we're doing custom bass traps, and it's more passive absorbers, to have bass traps that are 2 to 3 feet thick in some areas. It's something where we really have to address certain issues. You have to take up some square footage, which honestly makes it a challenge for some people to have small rooms. If you have a 10-foot by 10-foot bedroom and someone tells you want to put 3 feet of treatment on the back wall, you're like, I won't have anywhere to move. And so it's important to have a big enough space to be able to trap it appropriately.
Sure.
Now, when it comes, that's passive absorbers. So, things that are just going to, I call them innocent bystanders. They're just there and they're not reacting or flexing with the sound or anything like that. They're just, it's a friction loss in that resistance that it offers. But then there's actually tuned traps like diaphragmatic absorbers and Helmholtz resonators. And I've got some examples here on the screen of diaphragmatic absorbers. So this is something that you would build on the wall surface. And so we have the wall here. Let me get the tool here. We have the wall here, and then you put some wood framing here at the bottom and the top. And you take some sort of substrate. Now, you need to know the density of that substrate and the mass per area of that material. So, but in this example, it's plywood. So you see this plywood surface here that's on the front face of this diaphragmatic absorber, and what you do is you can actually, there's a whole calculation you can do to tune this cavity that you create with this wood blocking and this front kind of membrane that you're putting on it, that you can tune it for certain frequencies. And it's pretty amazing. Like you can say, hey, I'm using 1/4-inch plywood. It has this dense surface density. And how far do I need to put it away from the wall in order to focus on 70 hertz? Like you can do all of that math and figure it out.
Sure.
Now, I will say, with diaphragmatic absorbers or anything that's tuned, you have to be really careful that you build it to the tightest tolerances that you can, because you can end up building it, and if your tolerances are off, it's tuned for a completely different frequency.
Sure.
And it's not going to do a good job in your room, because your room might exhibit this issue at 70 hertz, but if you built something for 75 hertz, you've kind of wasted your time and money. And so that's something where building passive absorbers is pretty easy to do and hard to mess up, because you're just getting the right thickness and you putting it in the right places and it does its job. But these diaphragmatic absorbers, Helmholtz resonators, when they're tuned, you just have to be really specific with what you're doing. But yeah, the thing about diaphragmatic absorbers and Helmholtz resonators is that the performance of them, you can get just an insane amount of absorption at very specific frequencies.
Sure. But
the Q is pretty narrow. Like it spikes up in absorption at certain frequencies, and then after that it does hardly anything to the sound.
Sure.
So this graph here actually shows a few different panel absorbers, so diaphragmatic absorbers, and in the notes there it says that let's just clarify this first. This is absorption coefficient on the y-axis, and then we've got frequency on the x-axis here. So from left to right, we're going from low frequencies up to higher frequencies, and then up and down is how high that absorption coefficient, so how much absorption you're getting out of that unit. And so the A line here is actually a 3/16 inch plywood with a 2-inch airspace. Okay, and that is the performance that you get out of it. It's just kind of a general, and I'll trace it here because there's 3 different lines. You get some absorption, but nothing spikes up too much in this scenario. But then if you take the B line is 1/16 inch plywood with 1-inch mineral wool and a 1/4-inch airspace. Now it's something's happening, right? Like you have that in there. Having the mineral wool within it actually widens your effective frequency range a little bit, but you get this big spike in energy here, in absorption at around like 0.65 absorption coefficient. Now C, this next line here, C, is the same as B, but it's a 1/8 inch panel instead of a 16th inch panel of plywood. And so notice how that shifted the frequency, the peak frequency down lower in the frequency range. So it's really fun to be able to play with this. I can't say that it's fun to build them because your tolerances have to be spot on.
Sure.
But it can be a tool that acousticians use and people that are trying to improve their room just to get better results.
So in building these, is this something that you see a lot of clients will build it themselves, or is it something that they tend to source out just because it is so specific?
That's a great question. I would say that most people are building it themselves because there's not many manufacturers that are building these diaphragmatic absorbers, because they would have to have so many SKUs to affect all the specific frequency issues that people have.
Sure.
And so a lot of times it's custom built, and it's either the end user or clients doing it, or an installer of acoustical materials would be building it themselves.
Sure.
The next thing we're going to talk about is Helmholtz Resonators. Mm-hmm. And Helmholtz Resonators are basically these tuned devices that, again, can help absorb sound. We're all familiar with Helmholtz Resonators, whether we know it or not, because one of the best examples, I'll show it on the screen here, is a Coke bottle. We've all kind of blown across the top of a Coke bottle, and you can make a tone. Mm-hmm. Well, that Coke bottle is tuned for that frequency, and that can help absorb that energy if you put a bunch of Coke bottles in your room. Now, I'm not recommending that necessarily. We did talk in an earlier episode about how I almost worked for Pepsi. Mm-hmm. I guess this would work for Pepsi bottles too, but Coke bottles I think are better Helmholtz Resonators, just for the record. So Helmholtz Resonators are these tuned cavities that have an opening to it that would allow the sound to resonate that unit and then absorb that energy that way. In fact, there's some cool things, like there's these churches in Sweden and Denmark and Russia that actually have Helmholtz Resonators built into their walls, which is really, really cool. And it was a way for them to help control reverb time in the space. And this graphic that I'm showing here just shows the front edge of a wall, and then they would actually just cut into the wall and create these cavities that would be tuned for the frequency issues that they had in the space, which is just wild to me. And some of them were found, you see on this example, there's a bunch of little specks there. Some of them were found with ashes in them, and that was their way of having some resistive material in there so that it affects a wider, broader range of frequencies. Oh, wow. So it's pretty amazing, and I have actually a picture of one of the Russian churches in the ceiling there. You see all those holes, and behind each one of those holes are these pots that are inset, and some of them were different sizes to affect different frequency ranges, and just pretty wild what Helmholtz resonators can do.
All right, so that's how bass trapping works. So then how do you know where to put them? The fact that they are so specific to each person's room.
Yeah, that's the thing with bass traps, is that you could put bass traps in the wrong location of your room. You have the right trap, but in the wrong location, and it won't do the job for you. So you really have to place things properly, and that's really kind of a whole episode on its own. Like, we're going to talk about room modes and be able to dive deep into that, and that's where the placement will really come into key. I mean, there's some general rules of thumbs, like the vertical corners, horizontal corners of the room are typical places where you would put bass traps, but especially when it comes to the tuned ones, is that you got to be real specific with where you place them to affect the right type of mode. So I think another episode is going to be really helpful for people to be able to figure out what to do with these bass traps.
Sure, absolutely. And so kind of on that note, as far as like how to apply all of these, one thing that I am constantly talking about on calls is just how absorption is not used for isolation. So do you want to talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, that's something that we get asked a lot, is that if I cover my entire room with foam or fiberglass or something like that, will my neighbors stop calling the cops, right?
Yeah.
And that's just not the case. Anything that is lightweight and porous, like these absorbers are, it's going to leak the sound out just the same amount as if you had no panels in the room. Like, you could cover 100% of the room and it wouldn't matter. It's something where you need mass in order to isolate spaces and vibration control, but anything that's lightweight and porous, it's like using the water analogy, where you fill up a room with water, and good isolated rooms, not going to let that water out.
Right.
Adding panels to that, like foam or fiberglass, the water will seep through that pretty easily. It just doesn't have enough mass to stop sound. So absorbers are not done, not used to block sound, but they can be used in a lot of different ways in a studio to make it sound better.
Sure.
And one thing that we tell people all the time is to place absorption at first reflection points. That's a really kind of entry level thing to do in your studio, is just try to hit these first reflection points, and you can do that with the mirror trick, which you can sit at your mix position, have a friend hold a mirror with their back to the wall, and kind of shuffle around the room, and always look at that mirror, and anytime you see the reflection, the visual reflection of your speaker in that mirror, just put a little X on the wall, and then you're going to go all around the entire room, and eventually you'll have a bunch of different locations where you saw that speaker. And if you put absorption in those locations at the very minimal level, your room is going to improve a ton just by hitting those spots. And so absorption at first reflection points is pretty common. Diffusion, a lot of times you end up placing that in a mix room, let's say, like on the rear wall behind you, in the rear half of the room, if you're doing kind of what's called a live end, dead end scenario, where the dead end would be where you're mixing, and so you're just hearing the speakers alone and less of the room, so you're doing more absorption towards the front. And then the back of the room can scatter sound because it's not at a first reflection point, and can make the room still sound very natural. So diffusion in the back of the room is pretty common. And we'll get into a lot more of when we go into case studies of projects, like why we chose what we did, and go into the locations of bass traps and diffusers and absorbers, and really dig into those fine details. But at a basic level, first reflection points with absorption is good. Diffusion in the back of the room is good. I will say that with diffusers, you got to be careful about how close you're sitting to them, because some diffusers, if you're sitting within 5 or 6 feet of that, anything less than that, you're not going to get the full benefit from the diffuser anyway. And sometimes it can cause some issues. But also, diffusion's typically more expensive than absorption. And so if you're in a small room and your head's like 3 feet from the back wall, I would rather you put really thick absorption on that back wall than go with diffusion, because you're just not going to get the full benefit of it. But there's a lot of neat ways to apply it. I will say that there's some things that you shouldn't do with these different materials, but for the most part, as long as you're following some steadfast rules about first reflection points and making sure that you're not overdoing it too. With absorption, I've seen rooms where it's like 100% covered with absorption material, and just becomes really lifeless and dead sounding, and not something that we're used to experiencing. So the room can get a little oppressive and not something you want to spend a bunch of time in there.
Sure.
So you got to be careful with the right balance between absorption, diffusion, bass trapping to make sure your room sounds natural for what you're doing.
Yep. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So that pretty much wraps up everything that we had for this episode. Do you have any closing comments that you wanted to add?
No, I would just say that with acoustics, there's a lot of research that people can do. There's great resources online. We're available for questions too, because I'm sure that this episode is as many questions as it answered. It probably created just as many.
Yep.
So feel free in the comments section to leave your questions. Also, you can email us at info@haversickdesigns.com. And anything that's on your mind or something you want some more clarification on, feel free to reach out, and we'd be glad to help you. But I really appreciate you guys being part of the Sound Project, and we'll see you next week.